You ever notice how families kind of have their own way of doing things, almost like it's passed down? Well, there's a really interesting parallel when we talk about starting new churches, a sort of genetic blueprint that shapes how they work and grow.
Yeah.
And today, we're going to dive deep into how that blueprint is modeled, how it gets replicated when new faith communities start.
Exactly. And our mission for this deep dive, really, is to get under the hood of what makes a healthy genetic blueprint for church planting. We've been looking through some notes that explore how to make sure new churches don't just, launch,
Right.
but are actually wired for long-term health,
Yeah.
able to multiply on their own across generations without always needing outside help.
Okay, so these notes we're looking at suggest this blueprint isn't primarily passed on through like manuals or formal training, but through something much more hands-on modeling, showing the way, basically.
And what's really crucial here, the notes emphasize, is whether that modeling can actually be reproduced by the local people themselves. Our notes phrase it something like this: the effectiveness of modeling is directly proportional to its reproducibility. So if the local people can reproduce the church in future generations, then the planter has given them a healthy genetic blueprint. It's not about the initial, big splats.
That's whether it sticks locally.
Exactly. Can they carry it on? The notes stress this: we must consider reproducibility over the long run. The planter needs to think, will this church be able to reproduce itself years down the line after I'm gone? Will it function independently, without outside money or outside people coming in?
That's a huge question. It's not just about getting it started. It's about, can it sustain itself and multiply?
Which brings us to a really key point: who is being modeled as capable of actually doing the ministry? Our notes break this down, starting with leadership.
Right. And the notes kind of push back against the idea that you have to have a seminary-trained, full-time paid pastor to lead a church.
Yeah, they point back to the New Testament, Acts 6, for instance, where the main criteria were good reputation, full of the Spirit, wisdom, and how Paul and Timothy and Titus appointed elders from within the local groups. It wasn't primarily about academic degrees.
So the warning is, don't impose extra biblical requirements.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Because if the model that gets ingrained is only experts can lead, well, that naturally limits reproducibility, doesn't it?
Yeah, it makes it harder for the next group to start.
The notes really push for modeling, that, typical church members, people right there in the community, can take on leadership roles in their own groups. You can picture someone maybe quiet, unassuming, stepping up because they saw it was possible.
It's about empowering people from within, and that idea extends beyond just leading, right? The notes also look at who can be a church planter.
Yes, exactly. And it challenges the notion that maybe only highly educated believers are cut out for that.
Okay.
Think about Paul's companions, that they came from all sorts of backgrounds. The core idea is modeling that even, relatively new believers can and really should be involved in planting efforts.
So experienced planters should intentionally take local folks with them, whatever their education.
That's the picture painted, yeah, to show it's doable.
That makes a lot of sense, because if the planting team looks like some kind of elite squad,
Right.
how does the average person ever see themselves doing it? Okay, the notes also hit on evangelism. This one stood out to me.
Yeah, it's fundamental. The notes stress that sharing the good news is for every follower of Christ, not just a select few. And it critiques that tendency sometimes, to tell enthusiastic new believers, whoa, slow down, sit down. You need to learn more first.
Yeah, don't quench the spirit, basically.
Instead, it points to Jesus telling people, go tell what God did for you. And that amazing picture in Acts 8 where all the scattered believers were spreading the word. Evangelism becomes part of the church's DNA from the get-go.
Modeling it as just a normal part of Christian life, not some specialized task.
You got it. And then there's the whole area of training.
Right. Who gets to train others?
Well, the notes question whether it's only seminary professors or Bible school teachers who are qualified, or if you absolutely need a formal degree. It points back to Jesus' method. He chose some guys and just poured his life into them. And Paul telling Timothy in 2 Timothy 2.2 to entrust what he learned to reliable people who can then teach others. It's a chain reaction.
So the emphasis is more on character and spiritual maturity.
Exactly. Those are seen as the major qualifications. The notes really champion this kind of learn a little, practice it, share it immediately approach.
Takes the mystery out of it.
It does. Makes it accessible. It's trying to recover that, almost lost art of real person-to-person discipleship and mentoring.
Okay, so that's who does the ministry. Now, shifting gears a bit, The notes also tackle the issue of control, who's in charge.
Yeah, this is a big one. Who owns the new church? Who calls the shots?
And the notes are pretty clear, right? The planter is crucial, obviously, but shouldn't maintain long-term control from the outside.
No, the analogy used is more like a spiritual parent or mentor, not a controller. The push is to help the new church raise up its own local leaders almost right away and give them real responsibility.
Because outside control kind of stunts growth.
It absolutely can. It stifles initiative and reproduction. It's like trying to teach a kid to ride a bike, but never letting go of the seat. They have to wobble and maybe fall a bit to learn.
Good analogy. If someone else is always making the calls, the local folks never gain the confidence to lead or plant themselves.
And the notes also warn against the planter trying to do everything themselves. That models dependency. Instead, model that every member has a part to play.
Okay, so we've covered who and touched on control. What about what is actually modeled? What activities?
Right, so the notes lay out several key ministry functions that need to be modeled. First off, simply leading others to faith.
Seems pretty basic, but maybe easily overlooked.
It can be. The planter needs to be actively showing how to share the gospel, how to guide people to Christ right from the start, and making sure new believers are encouraged and equipped to do the same. It needs to be in the church's genetic code, so to speak.
So personal evangelism by everyone isn't just an optional extra.
It's modeled as core. Then, related to what we said earlier, deliberately preparing others to lead.
Like Jesus with the 12, Paul with his companions.
Exactly. Making it an open, intentional process, so that becomes the norm.
Yeah.
People see leadership development happening, and they expect it to continue.
And then the act of starting new churches itself.
Yeah, the notes challenge the idea that this is only for, professional missionaries or planters.
It's a different mindset, isn't it? Like the goal isn't just converts or getting people into our church, but intentionally planting a new community of faith wherever the gospel takes root. Modeling that expansion is natural.
And modeling that churches should encourage each other, like we see in the New Testament, sending gifts, being an example like the Thessalonians were. It models interdependence.
So churches supporting other churches, not being isolated.
Exactly, which ties into modeling responsibility for and to one another within the church body. Mutual accountability.
Like Paul talks about, submitting to one another.
Modeling that we're all in this together. And then a really strong emphasis on using a team approach.
Jesus sending them out in pairs.
Paul and Barnabas, Paul and Silas and Timothy. The New Testament pattern is overwhelmingly ministry in teams. So the planter should always try to take others along, modeling collaboration.
Which naturally leads to the next point in the notes about multiple leadership forms.
It does. The notes suggest the common one senior pastor model might not fully reflect the New Testament pattern of appointing elders plural in each church.
Citing passages like Ephesians 4 or Romans 12 about diverse gifts.
Right. So the model should ideally show a team of leaders with different strengths working together, rather than relying on just one person to do everything.
Okay. And related to leadership, the notes talk about empowering rather than controlling.
Yeah. Defining leadership as serving others, helping them use their gifts. Not seeking power or position, like Jesus warned against in Luke 22 when the disciples were arguing about who was greatest.
Modeling servant leadership.
That's the heart of it. Delegating real authority, not just tasks. And finally, under what is modeled, the notes suggest participative teaching and worship.
Meaning not just one person talking the whole time.
Exactly. Pointing to passages like 1 Corinthians 14 or Ephesians 5,
Yeah.
where it sounds like gatherings were much more interactive. People sharing psalms, teachings, revelations, songs.
More believer-focused, as the notes put it, where lots of people contribute.
That's the idea. Modeling a less centralized, more participatory gathering.
Wow, okay. That covers a lot under what to model. Now, the notes also look at when things should happen in ministry, starting with baptism.
Right. And here it's about balance. The notes warn against baptizing too quickly before someone really grasps the cost of discipleship. Luke 14 comes to mind.
Counting the cost.
But also waiting too long can kind of dampen that initial enthusiasm. So modeling a thoughtful timing.
Makes sense. Then there's the timing of leadership turnover. You mentioned this earlier regarding control.
Yeah, it comes up again. Staying in charge too long creates dependency. The notes offer this really insightful thought from Philippians 1 that maybe sometimes our lack of confidence in new believers is actually a lack of confidence in God's work in them.
Ooh, that's challenging.
Isn't it? So the model is equip, empower, and then transition leadership to local people relatively quickly, to fuel multiplication.
And similarly, involving new believers in ministry immediately.
Yes, the idea is that getting involved right away strengthens their own faith and helps the church reproduce faster, taking them along, encouraging them to share their story, like Jesus told the man in Luke 8.
Get them participating straight away, praying for the sick, helping others.
And that connects to starting new churches when there are new believers, instead of just trying to build one big church.
Right.
The notes advocate for lay leadership in smaller house church settings, which makes it much easier and faster to start new groups whenever people come to faith.
A more decentralized, rapid spread model.
Exactly. And lastly, under when, the notes mention encouraging frequent gatherings for study and fellowship.
Contrasting the early church meeting almost daily in Acts 2 with maybe just Sunday worship later on.
Yeah, suggesting that maybe infrequent meetings contribute to weaker believers. So model and encourage lots of smaller get-togethers in homes during the week.
Okay, so that's the when. What about where ministry is modeled?
Well, first and foremost, the notes emphasize homes and businesses, really pushing back against what they call the castle mentality of needing a special church building.
Pointing out the early church met in homes, right?
Right, or wherever people gathered. The building focus came much later. The key model is that a gathering of believers, wherever it happens, living room, a shop, under a tree, is church. Matthew 18:20.
So ministry isn't tied to a specific place. It happens anywhere, anytime.
That's the model. And then broadening the where, the notes connected directly to Acts 1.8 modeling ministry locally in nearby unreached areas, just as you go about life and ultimately to the ends of the earth.
So new believers should be modeled this sense of responsibility for their community, but also for places far beyond.
Yes, even if it's just through prayer and support initially, instilling that outward global vision from the start.
Okay. We've covered who, what, when, where. The final piece is why. What are the motivations modeled?
The notes list several core reasons. First, just the nature of the gospel itself. It's good news. It compels you to share it, just like Jesus ministered.
It's inherent in the message.
Then the will of God. Citing 2 Peter 3.9, God doesn't want anyone to perish. That's a powerful motivator.
Simple obedience, too.
Absolutely. Obedience to Christ's commands. The notes mention Peter going to the Gentiles, even though it was difficult for him, out of obedience.
And that idea of freely received, freely give.
Yes, recognizing God's immense grace and mercy to us motivates us to share those blessings, both spiritual and material, with others.
And underlying all of that.
Love. Ultimately, it comes down to love. God is love, as 1 John says. So love for God and love for others should be the absolute core motivation modeled in all ministry.
Okay, so that paints a really comprehensive picture of this genetic blueprint. Who, what, when, where, why. How do the notes suggest putting this all together practically?
They introduce a pretty straightforward four-step process. Model, assist, watch, and leave.
Model, assist, watch, leave.
Okay. In the model stage, the planter is very hands-on, demonstrating all these principles we've discussed while planting that first church. They're showing how it's done.
Right. Then assist.
That's when the first church, the one that was just planted, tries to reproduce itself by planting another church. The original planter is still around, but more in the background, assisting, coaching, helping them figure it out.
Okay, so they're doing it with support.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Then comes the watch stage. Now, that first church plants a second new church. And this time, the original planter steps back even further, just watching from a distance, only offering advice if asked.
Letting them fly solo, more or less.
Pretty much. And crucially, the church that was planted during the assist phase is also expected to be planting by now, with the first church assisting them. You see the generation starting.
Yeah, it's multiplying. Okay, and the final step, leave.
Once the planter sees that the churches are reproducing healthfully on their own, beyond that second generation, they can then move on to a completely new area to start the process again. Not abandoning the previous churches, but trusting the blueprint is working.
It's a clear strategy for creating self-sustaining, multiplying movements.
That's the goal, to embed that healthy genetic code so it just keeps going.
So bringing this all together, our deep dive into these notes really shows that the absolute key to planting churches that last and multiply is all about intentionally modeling this healthy genetic blueprint. It's not just about the theology, but the who gets empowered, the what, the actual practices, the when and where, the timing and context, and maybe most importantly, the why, the core motivations.
Which leads us to maybe a final thought for you, the listener, to chew on. As you think about your own context, maybe it's church planting, maybe it's business, maybe it's any kind of project focused on growth and replication, Which elements of this healthy genetic blueprint we've discussed do you think would be the most challenging to actually implement well, and why?
Hmm.
Thinking about those potential hurdles and how these principles might apply could really unlock some insights for fostering a more sustainable and multiplying impact, whatever you're involved in.